The following program is a production of Truth for the World.
Ye servants of God, your Master proclaim, and publish abroad his wonderful name, the name all victorious of Jesus extol. His kingdom is glorious, he rules over all.
We're continuing to look at the book of 1 Thessalonians, looking at 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and the idea of an exemplary preaching. Paul has been writing back to the Thessalonians, and he's praised them and talked about how they were ensamples or patterns for human behavior. Remember, he's also sending this letter along with Silas and Timothy, and in this next part of the letter, Paul will talk about the contrast between his group and other teachers. So he is going to tell us what is exemplary preaching, or a good pattern of behavior for preaching. And the first thing that we notice is that good preaching, or exemplary preaching, is to please God. To please God. Chapter 2 and verse 1 says, "For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain." The preaching of the gospel was not in vain to the Thessalonians because they'd heard it, they believed it, and they obeyed it. This is not to say that preaching to those who don't believe is vain. The preaching and work for God is never in vain because it is the work of God and the work we're supposed to be doing. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58 reminds us, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." To the people who refuse to accept it, to them it has been given in vain. They will not do what needs to be done with it. Our work is not in vain because we have given them the opportunity to obey the gospel, and that should never be described as work that we should not have done. The measure of our success is whether or not we sow and water, not whether or not someone decides to accept the gospel. The mail carrier's success is determined by whether the message is delivered, not by whether or not the message is liked, appreciated, or accepted. Similarly, the measure of our success is not how many people are converted, but how much teaching and watering we do. Paul said, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase." We should not look upon our work as being in vain. We should look upon our work as pleasing God. And besides pleasing God, good preaching should be, of course, to benefit others. To benefit others. Paul and the others had suffered in Philippi. You recall Paul and Silas were in jail and had been beaten. But that did not stop Paul and Silas from continuing to preach. Verse 2, he says, "But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the face of great opposition." The Lexham Greek New Testament translates this verse as, "had already suffered and been mistreated." Had already suffered and been mistreated. The idea of mistreat is part of the possible definition of the word translated as were shamefully entreated. You know what it means to mistreat someone? It's to treat them wrongfully. This word is used to describe what would happen to Christ. What happened to Christ was definitely a mistreatment because Christ did not deserve the treatment he received. You recall it said in Luke 18:32, "He shall be delivered up into the Gentiles to be mocked, shamefully treated." Mistreated. Not treated the way he deserved, mistreated, shamefully treated, and spit upon. Well, remember that Paul and Silas had been beaten. If you look in Acts chapter 16, starting in verse 19, Paul and Silas had been beaten and imprisoned in Philippi. When their masters saw that the hope of their gains was gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace and to the rulers, and brought them to the magistrates and said, "These men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city, and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans." And the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes and commanded to beat them. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. Notice from verse 21 that the people there in Philippi talk about the idea that what Paul and Silas are preaching is encouraging behavior that is not lawful for Romans to do. Well, this is ironic because Paul and Silas are Roman citizens, and therefore they were protected from beatings and imprisonment without due process. But they did not get due process. They were stripped of their clothes, they were beaten, and thrown into prison. So the people that claim these people are here preaching against Roman law are in themselves violating Roman law by the way they treated Paul and Silas. When the magistrates learned that Paul and Silas were Romans, they knew they had messed up. In Acts chapter 16, verse 36, the keeper of the prison told this saying to Paul, "The magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace." Paul said to them, "They have beaten us openly, uncondemned, being Romans, and have cast us into prison. And now do they thrust us out privily? Nay, verily, but let them come themselves and fetch us out." And the sergeants told these words unto the magistrates, and they feared when they heard that they were Romans. Why? Because they knew they had done wrong. You did not bind Roman citizens. You did not beat Roman citizens. You did not imprison Roman citizens without due process. And you did not scourge a Roman citizen for interrogation. And even if you put a Roman citizen to death, you did not crucify a Roman citizen. Romans had rights. In Acts chapter 22, later in that same book, the chief captain commanded him, talking about Paul, to be brought into the castle. This is a later event. And bade that he should be examined by scourging. In other words, we're going to beat him until he tells us what he knows, that he might know wherefore they cried so against him. And as they bound him with thongs, Paul said unto the centurion that stood by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man that is a Roman and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard that, he went and told the chief captain, saying, "Take heed what thou doest, for this man is a Roman." When the chief captain came and said unto him, "Tell me, art thou a Roman?" he said, Yea. And the chief captain answered, "With a great sum obtained I this freedom." And Paul said, "But I was freeborn." Then straightway they departed from him, which should have examined him, and the chief captain also was afraid. Well, why was he afraid? They hadn't beaten him. He was afraid because he knew he was a Roman and because he had bound him. It was illegal to bind a Roman, much less beat him. And he had already bound him, and he was afraid because he had messed up. Paul had not been scourged, but even the binding of a Roman citizen was not allowed. Notice again Paul's description of their treatment in Philippi. Though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated. Oh, he's absolutely right. They'd been bound, they'd been beaten, they'd been thrown into prison, all without due process. And that was totally illegal and unjust. When Paul was about to be scourged for interrogation in Acts 22, he told the centurion he was a Roman. The question we may have is, why did Paul not announce that he and Silas were Romans as the people in Philippi were preparing to beat them? Why didn't he bring it up? He brought it up after they'd been in prison and were told they could let go, but why didn't he bring it up before they were beaten and put in prison? Well, we may not be totally sure why Paul delayed his announcement that he and Silas were Roman citizens until the time when the magistrates issued their release. Darrell Bach mentions that perhaps Paul tried to announce his Roman citizenship, but there may have been a mob rule mentality and disruption at the time, and it fell on non-receptive ears. And that sounds possible. However, another reason suggested by him is that Paul timed his announcement in order to protect the other believers in the city. Perhaps Paul did not attempt to stop his persecution as he was willing to suffer for Jesus. However, Paul knew that he and Silas had been unjustly and unlawfully beaten and imprisoned as Roman citizens. The problem was that the magistrates of the city were apparently willing to let mob rule take over and treat people unfairly. And now these magistrates wanted to try and let Paul and Silas go in private. So Paul announces his Roman citizenship and informs the magistrates that if Paul and Silas are to be released, then you need to come down here to the prison and do it yourself. This may show everyone that the magistrates are letting the men go and there is nothing wrong with them. It would be a public proclamation instead of something done privately. Perhaps everyone would also hear what the magistrates had done to Roman citizens. Through this public proclamation, everybody may learn, look, we're Romans, and here's what the magistrates have done to us. Paul does not demand justice by having the magistrates beaten, but instead agrees to leave town. So Paul really may not be upset that he was beaten or that the magistrates were not justly punished, but Paul may have done this to publicly expose the unjust actions of the magistrates and make them hesitant to do something like that again to believers. He may have even gone through the beating, in other words, in order to publicly expose what was going on so that it wouldn't happen again to the believers that he would leave behind. Maybe the magistrates would think twice about beating and jailing others accused of Christianity with the memory of what happened with Paul and Silas still fresh on their minds. But whatever the case, Paul and Silas did not let their experience in Philippi stop them. In fact, they had the courage to speak in Thessalonica even though there was opposition. In Acts 17, verses 1 through 6, they passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia. They came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures, opening and alleging that Christ must needs have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Jesus whom I preach unto you is Christ. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few. But the Jews which believed not, moved with envy, took unto them certain lewd fellows of the baser sort, and gathered a company, and set all the city on an uproar, and assaulted the house of Jason, and sought to bring them out to the people. And when they found them not, they drew Jason and certain brethren unto the rulers of the city, crying, These that have turned the world upside down are come hither also. Paul and Silas taught for the benefit of others, and that was exemplary preaching, to benefit others. Also, not for selfish motives or deceit. Exemplary preaching is not for selfish motives or deceit. Paul now defends what he's trying to say. Yes, there was opposition to his preaching, but his preaching is not based on selfish motives or deceit. Verse 3, For our exhortation is not of error, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile. Besides, the motivation for Paul's preaching was not to please men anyway. It was to please God. Verse 4, Even as we have been approved of God to be entrusted with the gospel, so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who proveth our hearts. It is for God that we must preach, and the preaching that we do must be in order to please God, not men. If our preaching does not please men, then so be it, provided that it is the truth taught with long-suffering. As Paul told Timothy, I charge thee, therefore, before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort, with all long-suffering and doctrine. Verses 5 and 6, Paul further defends his preaching by stating that it was not for selfish reasons. Neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ. Covetousness is like greediness. Paul and Silas did not preach out of greed or an attempt to obtain glory. And Paul and Silas could have been burdensome to them financially, but notice he says, we might have been burdensome. But if you look at verse 9, he says, you remember, brothers, our labor and toil, we work night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you, while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. Paul would mention this in the second letter to the Thessalonians as well. Neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Remember, Paul had been taught as a tent maker. And the Jews may have a saying, you either teach your son a trade or you teach him to be a thief. So Paul was apparently schooled in religion, but he also knew how to do a trade, which was tent making. And Paul did not receive financial aid from people. Paul did receive financial aid from people, including aid from the people in Philippi, the Philippians. Philippians chapter 4, verses 15 through 16 says, you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica, ye sent once and again unto my necessity. So while he was there, he got aid. But Paul makes it clear when he came to Thessalonica, his preaching was not for selfish gains or to be a financial burden. He was willing to work. It was not a cloak of covetousness, and we did not seek glory. He tried not to be a burden to them, as he says in verse 9, so that he worked. Therefore, no one could point to his preaching and say it was for selfish reasons or for financial gain or personal glory. Exemplary preaching is not for selfish motives or deceit, nor is it to be done without care. Preaching is to be done out of care, concern. Paul had brought the gospel message to the Thessalonians because he cared for them. Verse 7, we were gentle among you, like a nurse taking care of her children. The English translations give the idea of being gentle among them. However, in the Greek, there's the verb of becoming, followed by the word for a child. In essence, Paul is stating that they became as children among the Thessalonians. Instead of teachers that came in and pushed the people around and sought their own desires and glory, Paul says they became as children. And he continues with a simile of a nurse taking care of her children, so that we can imagine the tender care of a woman taking care of a child, and that gives us a mental image of Paul with his care for the Thessalonians. He continues by saying in verse 8 that he's affectionately desirous of you. We were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you had become very dear to us. Affectionately desirous has a meaning of to have a strong yearning or longing for. Not only is Paul and the others willing to share the gospel, but they're willing to share themselves. He says, we were affectionately desirous of you, longing for you. At the end of verse 8, Paul mentions the Thessalonians had become very dear to them. Preaching is out of care for others, and it's also preaching that exhorts, comforts, and charges. Notice verses 10 and 11. Ye are witnesses, and God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe, as ye know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father doth his children. Paul states they had exhorted. That means to encourage, to urge. Preaching should be an urging and encouraging for people to do the right thing. Preaching should be a comfort. to console someone when they hurt, to give them positive information, to give them good news. After all, it's the good news of Jesus Christ. Hope, comfort, and preaching that is exemplary should give a charge, something that's urged due to great importance. We don't stand up here and preach. Hopefully someone doesn't stand up here and preach just to fill 30 minutes, but to say something of value, to say something that's important, to urge people to think about the right thing, to do the right thing. Good preaching encourages people, it consoles them, and it urges them to do something due to great importance. Paul even notes that this is the same type of behavior a father would do to his own children, to comfort them, to exhort them, to charge them. But what was Paul and the others urging the Thessalonians about? Verse 12, that ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you into his kingdom and glory. The messages preached were not just to make people feel good all the time or to justify sinful behavior. It was to try to urge people to walk in the right way, to walk like Christ. Preaching should encourage people to walk like Christ. Preaching should console people and give them hope and comfort that is available in Christ. And preaching should urge due to great importance because souls are on the line and salvation is at stake. But it should do so with truth and a goal of helping people walk worthy of God and walk like Christ. As we look at our conclusions, as Paul describes the Thessalonians as an exemplary church, he describes them as a good pattern of church behavior. We also get exemplary preaching from Paul, Silas, and Timothy. That preaching is a pattern of good preaching behavior. And the exemplary preaching is done in order to please God, not men. It's done to benefit others. And therefore it's not for selfish motives or deceit. It's done out of care, concern for others. And good preaching exhorts, tries to lift people up and encourage them. It comforts when they need it, but it also charges them and urges them to do the right thing due to great importance.
If you would like a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World, P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America. Or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org. What do you get from nothing? You know the answer. Nothing. Walk up to any bank teller in a bank where you do not have an account and ask to withdraw money from a savings account. How much will you get? Nothing. Why? Because you put nothing in. If the universe is not eternal, as science shows, then it must have had a beginning. But what came before the universe's beginning to get the universe started and to create it? If you don't choose God as the answer, then you are left with choosing nothing. Was there nothing before the universe and then the universe exploded in a big bang? How do you get a big bang out of nothing when you can't even get $5 out of nothing you put into the bank? The universe has a creator who came before it. What does he want for you? This has been a brief message from truthfortheworld.org. Visit us online at truthfortheworld.org or write us at P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America.
In the first 2 chapters of Genesis, we read about how in the Garden of Eden, God created a perfect man. He then gave to this man instructions on how to be faithful. But God had also given the man freedom to choose to do right or wrong. Man uses free moral choice to commit sin against God, and thus sin entered into the world. Throughout the Old Testament, we read that sacrifices were commanded to be offered to atone for sin. But even then the sins were not removed, but simply pushed aside. Man cannot pay for the terrible cost for sin, whether under the old law or the new law. But Jesus Christ came and lived a perfect life on this earth, tempted in all ways that we are, and yet he did not sin, Hebrews 4:15. Then he sacrificed his life for you and me. A perfect man introduced sin into this world in the Garden of Eden, so it required a perfect man to pay the cost for our sins.
Visit us online at truthfortheworld.org or write us at
P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America.
In our busy lives, we probably don't take much time to just sit and think. Your job may even give you projects to work on, but not much time to think about how to do them. By the time you get home from work, there may still be so much to do that thinking is not even on your agenda. Perhaps thinking is not even something we consider a regular activity or something to try and work into our lives. We may see it as a waste of time. But some ideas are too weighty and important not to think about them. Some questions demand time to think about them. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? The answers to these questions will literally determine your answers to all the other questions of life. Now that's something worth thinking about. This has been a message from truthfortheworld.org. Visit us online at truthfortheworld.org or write us at
P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America.
In Mark chapter 16 and verse 16, Jesus says, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved." In Acts chapter 2 and verse 38, Peter told the crowd to repent and be baptized. Did you notice the simple conjunction "and"? You remember conjunctions from English class, right? It's that simple little word that joins two or more things together. You probably use it all the time. When you order food, you might say, "Give me steak and potatoes." When you ask for dry cleaning, you might say, "Clean the pants and the jacket." We know what the word "and" means. We use it all the time. But so many will argue strongly that baptism is not necessary for salvation, or that the Bible does not say baptism is necessary. I wonder what those people would say if the waiter just brought them the potatoes or the dry cleaner just cleaned the pants. Would they argue about the use of the word "and"?
If you would like a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org.
I remember when Hurricane Katrina hit the United States. An atheist organization stated we should not be praying for the people affected by the hurricane. Instead, we should be sending them aid. Really? An atheist organization is telling us what we should and should not do? That sounds to me like they're telling me what is right and wrong. That sounds to me like they're making a moral judgment. Well, that begs the question, by what standard are they making this moral judgment of what is right and wrong? Well, I doubt it's by the Bible, so who is making this determination, and why should I follow them? What makes their judgment of morals any better than mine? Atheism is hypocritical because it claims no God and no right or wrong because the universe is an accident, but then atheists try to tell us what we should and should not do. This has been a brief message from truthfortheworld.org. Visit us online at truthfortheworld.org or write us at
P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America. If you would like a free Bible correspondence course, then write us at Truth for the World, P.O. Box 241, Bethel Springs, Tennessee, 38315, the United States of America. Or visit us online at truthfortheworld.org.